And today we have with us a very special guest, Kimberly Williams, she, her. She directs the Women's and Gender Studies program here at MRU. She teaches in subject areas that include men and masculinities, intersectional feminist, critical race and queer theories, the processes and politics of colonization, decolonization, transnational feminist movements, and global gender issues, including the global sex trade industry and healthcare policies and practices. Dr. Williams's research interrogates the power of dynamics of political projects that rely on settler colonial narratives for cohesion. She also offers a summer walking tour, booze, broads, and brothels based on her research on Calgary's historic sex industry. And without further ado, I am going to turn things over to Kimberly, and she will start her session of Stampede, Sex Tourism, Slut-Shaming, and Gender-Based Violence.
Cheers, Courtney. Thank you so much for that great introduction. And thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm so excited to be here and kind of in celebration of International Working Women's Day, which was yesterday. And so Courtney's going to share my PowerPoint presentation because I was having some technical difficulties. So yeah, Courtney, make that happen whenever you can. But while that's happening, I wanted to invite everyone to either ask, like, using your microphone or in the chat, which I will look at very briefly here. And just let me know if you have any particular questions or interests that have brought you here. You know, like why this talk today in the middle of this chaotic time in a semester at the end, possibly middle of a global health pandemic, right? Why this talk today? So if anybody has anything you want to make sure that I talk about, touch on, you know, I'd really like to know what that might be. So please don't be shy. Shout it on out. Otherwise, I'll just talk at you for a little while. Yeah, Milena, go for it.
Other than just, why not? I mean, this is, how could you miss a talk with this title? Honestly, it's been in my calendar for like 2 weeks. It feels like cake. Sorry, you're not cake. It's not fluffy. It's delicious.
I am happy to be chocolate cake.
That's what that's kind of how I'm seeing it. Anyway,
fine with me.
Other than all those things, I've I've been on your walk twice, and there was one piece that you've spoke to within that context that I would love to hear more about. You know, I've been now in Calgary, oh my gosh, 20 years, but I feel very new to Alberta. I still feel very, this feels new to me after even all that time.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you can speak to why Calgary, Alberta is so much more difficult for women.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear what you have to offer on that.
Okay. Yeah, I will some of that I think I'll tackle by virtue of what I was planning on talking about. And then if not, let's come back to that. Because there's a whole kind of sort of background and frame to this project that yes, I will talk about that for sure. Thank you. Yeah. What else? Anybody else? So I see in the chat, Kirsten, had asked, just, you have mixed feelings about the Stampede. So the title of the talk caught your attention. So I'll talk a little bit about why those mixed feelings. And I suspect many of us who have come today have those kinds of mixed feelings about this event. And I've been hearing a lot of that as I've kind of been talking about this book and writing this book. So I appreciate that comment as well. Anybody else have any, questions or things that are intriguing you? So Heather in the chat has written, interested in learning more about this through a different lens, right? Because you generally enjoy the spirit of Stampede quite. There's a whole sort of level of collegiality to it, a whole sort of level of community spirit to it that sort of is on the surface of some other pretty nasty things that I'll talk about a bit today. yeah, and then, how do we communicate with folks who don't understand that women have such a different experience, and also queers, and so I'll talk a little bit about the role of heteronormativity in the Stampede and some of its programming, and some of what goes on around the Stampede. Yeah, and Christy says the Stampede hasn't been fun since you were a little kid. Yeah, and I think that kind of gets at quite a lot of what many of us experience with the Stampede. Many of us who are cis women, trans women, queer folks, non-binary folks, right? Anybody who doesn't kind of fit into that heteronormative framework of what the Stampede is kind of advocating implicitly, right? Oh yes, of course, Heather, I gotcha. No worries at all. All right, so that gives me a great frame for kind of how to pitch this a little bit. So thank you all so much, and there'll be lots of time at the end to ask questions and have a really good conversation. So I really look forward to that. So yeah, so I'll just talk a little bit from my book, and oh, I just saw one more. Patty in the chat has said, working in the area of mental health, a nurse. So Patty's interested in the intersection of my talk and the impact on mental health. Yeah, wow, yes. Okay, I'm not gonna, I don't know, you know more about that than I do, but let's talk about that at the end, right? And so, yeah, the Stampede is very male dominated. And so I'll talk about why that matters as we go, right? So yeah, so my book, interestingly, it took me 10 years to write. Like Milena, I am not from Alberta, and I haven't lived here very long. I moved here in July of 2009. And that moment in which I started to work on this book was literally during my drive into town. I just didn't know it at the time. And so one of the things that is sort of got me started on this project was that I came to Calgary specifically to start my job at Mount Royal, which is as a women's and gender studies professor. And so I came to Calgary kind of with this toolkit already in place, right? I'm a queer feminist, I'm a white settler, I'm from the US East Coast. So, I got all kinds of like sort of different experiences than a place that hosts this event would lend itself to understanding, right? So I kind of drove into town, and I first started noticing some weird things. Like I arrived on July 4th, 2009, and I had been here once before, but that was just for my job interview. So, I had never really been to the city or lived in the city or experienced the city. And I was shocked by the fact that, like, in the middle of their corporate workday, in what I have been told is the center of, Canada's oil and gas industry, all these white men were just randomly off work in their cowboy boots and their jeans and their flannel shirts and their cowboy hats. And I thought that that was a little odd. I'm just setting myself a timer so I know how long I've been talking. Also, the servers at the pub where I had my first meal, because of course all my stuff was on a truck and it didn't arrive with me, right? So I had to be out for dinner and in a hotel, and they were all dressed in, short shorts and cowboy boots and cowboy hats. And I thought to myself, what is actually happening here? The bank where I opened my first checking account in Canada was like festooned with, hay bales and fencing, right? Ranch fencing. And the tellers were dressed in jeans and plaid shirts and cowboy boots. I was like, I didn't even know what was happening. And then there was also this billboard that I distinctly remember, and all y'all will remember this as well because it happens every summer. It was a billboard for a nightclub that said, "The most fun you can have with your boots on," right? And keep in mind my toolkit. I already was a women's and gender studies professor, right? So every sort of fiber of my feminist being was like, what is happening right now? What is happening right now in this city that I've just moved to? But the most memorable moment, I think, of that first week in Calgary was my dad had helped me drive up. So he and I were running errands, and he, sitting in the passenger seat of my car, and I'm driving, and we pull up to a stoplight. And we pulled up behind a massive, and I really do mean massive, pickup truck. And hanging from this truck's trailer hitch was a massive set of bright purple truck nuts. Courtney, switch my slide, please. And I was like praying, there's my truck nuts. And I was praying to like all the deities for this light to change before my father noticed what the heck we were looking at, because nobody wants that, to be in the front seat with your father looking at some truck nuts. It didn't, though. The light remained red. And my dad, it was like this slow motion moment. He like leaned forward in his seat, and he was squinting, and he was trying to get a better look at like what was happening in front of us. And he asked, "Is that?" And then he like turned beet red, just beet red. And he looked at me and he goes, "What the fuck?" Yes. And then we both laughed out loud, because, you have to just laugh out loud when your father asks you what the fuck about some truck nuts hanging off a massive truck in front of you. There's nothing else to be done. But then we rolled our eyes, and because, we're laughing, and like father, like daughter, and it is what it is. Now, it's important to know, right, that humor is a key tool of my feminist killjoy survival kit, because it has to be. When you read and you write and you teach about such heavy histories, as I do every day, it's literally my job. And I joke to my students all the time that my job is to spread bad news, and then my job is to tell them how to change it. But I do spread a lot of bad news. And so, I'm dealing every day with like norms that tighten around us the more we fail to inhabit them. And it really makes it difficult to breathe sometimes. And so sometimes you just have to laugh. And this laughter, this act of laughing, it just gives us resources, right? It gives us the resources and the resiliency to like bear witness and to expose things and to bring things to the surface so they can be laughed at. And I'm paraphrasing right now a feminist theorist whose name is Sarah Ahmed, who I'll come back to a little bit towards the end here. And so, my dad and I, in our encounter with these truck nuts back in 2009, makes us laugh. Because, I hope you're laughing. I can't tell. I think you are. Because it's funny, right? Because those truck nuts made us laugh. But after we laughed, we rolled our eyes. Can you switch my slide, Courtney, please? So why? Why did we roll our eyes? So to roll one's eyes these days is generally interpreted as like a negative response to whatever it is or whoever it is you're rolling your eyes at, right? So Wikipedia says that eye rolling is a response to an undesirable situation or an undesirable person. It's used to disagree or dismiss. Well, Lebanese-Canadian artist, writer, and organizer Christina Hajar, who I've quoted here on the slide, she says that we roll our eyes as a killjoy strategy. It's an acknowledgement to ourselves that what we've just witnessed or endured is not okay. We roll our eyes to dismiss someone or something so as not to internalize it. And we roll our eyes in disbelief, in pleasure, also in transcendence, and euphoria. And so one of the things to think about as I interrupt myself here is think about, eye rolling as orgasmic as well, right? But our eye sockets are portals for escape in the eye rolling. So eye sockets as portals for escape. And I don't know about you all, but I think we all do a lot of eye rolling if we're sitting in meetings or classes or, just situations that we're just like, what is happening here? And so this is why we're rolling our eyes, right? So let's consider, why did Dad and I roll our eyes at the truck nuts? What wasn't okay in that moment, and what was like so undesirable and disagreeable? What were we dismissing, and what were we escaping? Now, these probably seem like sort of strange questions. I mean, because who cares? I mean, they're just chuck nuts. We see them everywhere. They're like ubiquitous in Alberta, so much so that the Beaverton, which is Canada's national online news satire source, they posted an article a few years ago that was entitled "Truck Nuts, Lovingly Placed into Winter Storage." And in this article, a fictional local man named Terence McGillivray laments having to castrate his own truck to protect his prized truck nuts from the notoriously harsh Albertan winter. That was from the Beaverton in 2018. And then, of course, in 2019, comedian Peter Brown on The Debaters, which is the CBC radio show, he asked if Alberta were to or he said that if Alberta were to separate from the rest of Canada, its new official legume would be truck nuts. You know, that's how sort of ubiquitous they are, right? And so truck nuts and the mostly men who adorn their truck with them seem to be part of the very fabric of Alberta. I mean, they're so silly that we like tend not to even notice them or take them seriously. And we just roll our eyes if we happen to pull up behind somebody at a stoplight. But an eye roll, Sarah Ahmed says, can be feminist pedagogy. So in other words, when you roll your eyes, this is a feminist teaching moment. You can learn something from what you're rolling your eyes at. So what if, as curious feminists, we actually take these truck nuts seriously? What if we ask feminist questions about what Dad and I, and all of us, by the way, are meant to learn from the quintessential Alberta legumes? And what if we consider what they might have to do with the Calgary Stampede? So that's what my book's about, and that's what I'll talk about a bit today, which connects to this weird feeling that you kind of have about some of the things that might go on at the Stampede, and also Melena's question about the status of women in Calgary and why it is so quite terrible here for us, even though most of us don't know it and notice it. So, as a cultural studies scholar, I actually tend to gravitate towards images as a way of making sense of complex concepts. So I actually want to start our conversation today with an image, by discussing this one image from the Calgary Stampede planner in 2012. And thanks, Courtney, you anticipated me. Cheers. This was an advertisement that was in the 2012 Calgary Stampede planner. The Centennial Stampede was a key text in my research. So that 2012 Stampede, right? The centennial being the 100-year anniversary of something. So ostensibly you're going to like do a job and really celebrate and make it a big deal, right? And so the 2012 Stampede was crucial in much of my research. So Shell here, Shell Canada, this location, we're at a gas station. Presumably it's a Shell gas station, since it's a Shell. Oh yes, it is a Shell gas station. And to the left, you see that there's a sort of man in focus, but he's in the background. And in the foreground is the gas pump, and they're ready to use each other, right? The guy is ready to use the gas pump. The gas pump is at the ready to be used. This man is presumably a cis man. He appears to be culturally intelligible as white. He's wearing an outfit that places him roughly in the very early 20th century, right? And this is the historical period in which Shell started operating in Canada. And it's also the time during which Guy Wiedeck started the Stampede in 1912. So our subject here, he's wearing dark pants. He's got a black brocade suit vest. He is jacketless. He's also got a long sleeve button down shirt in the Shell yellow color. And there's that single black ribbon tied in a bow at his button collar. And you'll notice that the right corner of his vest is like folded up a little bit. And it reveals a shiny black inner lining, but then also the brown leather pouch that's attached to his belt and his gold buckle. Now we can't see the area below his shins, right? So we don't know what kind of shoes he's wearing. But, you know, we can imagine that he's wearing those cowboy boots, the Western style boots that are so frequently associated with ranching on the Canadian prairies. Also, it's important to know his headwear is a gambler style hat. So it's not the typical ranch style 10-gallon hat that we're kind of used to seeing. This particular hat, a gambler hat, was associated with a particular socioeconomic class of men, of white settler men in the prairies at that time. So he's a city slicker, interestingly. Probably he's a business owner. He's definitely a community leader. Maybe he's a Shell executive from 1912. So from the viewer's perspective, right, we're perched low. We're in front of this gas pump, and we see that this man's walking toward us. He's also walking towards the pump. So we need to look up, and we see his unshaven face. He's got this wide brim of his hat is casting the shadow, and his facial expression is interestingly one of purpose, right? His eyes are determinedly focused on the task at hand, which, according to like the apparent momentum of his body, is to get to and use that gas pump. And his right hand is kind of swinging by his side, and his left is poised to lift the gas pump out of its, or is it his, holster. So although Shell's urban cowboy has no actual gun, right, and a gun was a key tool of late 19th century colonial conquest, this ad riffs quite successfully off those gunslinger duels that are so much a part of the Hollywoodization of what sociologist Will Wright calls the frontier myth. Courtney, can you switch my slide, please? Now, the frontier myth has 4 essential components, according to Will Wright. The first is an open, vast, and supposedly empty land. The second is the heroic white cowboy. The third is the subjugation of white settler women. And this part is really important, right? Because the white settler women are relegated to home and hearth and violently punished if they don't stay there. This is part of the frontier myth. Think about all the Westerns you've ever seen, right? And the fourth component is that there are clearly defined villains. And these villains often will appear in the figure of local indigenous people. And of course, the cowboy has to disappear all the indigenous people from the not so empty after all frontier before he can harvest the resources above, or in this case, under the land. And so this ad is interestingly, this Shell ad, is interestingly an encounter between Alberta's oil and gas industry and all its myriad enemies. And so the ads seem to suggest, or maybe even to warn, that here in Calgary, we're living out our very own Western. And this urban gunslinger is reaching for his gun to defend his community against anyone or anything that's not part of sustaining it. These days, in early 21st century Alberta, so 100 years later than this cowboy is supposed to be living, this ad first appeared in the Centennial Stampede's planner. It's generally well known that these villains, quote unquote, include, but are just not limited to, Indigenous people, feminists, racialized immigrants, LGBTQS plus people, and climate justice activists. So feminist and critical masculinity scholars have written much on the conflation of pop culture of guns and other weapons with phalluses, right? So in other words, there's a whole literature of like, when you see a gun, chances are it's being sexualized as a man's penis. And it's well known that men who use violence often feel disempowered by wider social and economic factors. Interestingly, this may get a little bit to the question, I think it was Patty in the chat that talked about wanting to know about the connection to mental illness, right? Men who use violence often feel disempowered. This is very, very well researched. And so as a consequence, they're encouraged to own guns by reinforcing the symbolism of the gun as a status symbol. It's a way of accessing power and resources. So here we arrive at the defensive posturing inherent in Alberta's petro-masculine culture. Courtney, can you switch my slide next? So there's this self-perceived disempowerment of white cis men, and it causes their reactivity and defensiveness, which then justifies their use of power over through the barrel of a gun or a gas pump. And as I'm going to interrupt myself, because as I'm talking to you, one of the ways I was going to maybe come into this conversation today was telling you that I've been thinking an awful lot lately of trucks and tanks and the gas that is needed to power those trucks and those tanks that then can be used to invade sovereign nations and also block international borders and occupy national capitals. But perhaps we can come back at the end. So this is one reason that the prominent foregrounding of a gas pump here, right, principally its long black phallic hose in the Shell ad matters so much, because this ad was much more than an appeal to Centennial Stampede goers to pump their gas at Shell stations. It certainly is that, but it's more. Instead, it actually overlays the mythical subject of the frontier cowboy, who's always already a white cis man, by the way. It overlays the frontier cowboy onto Alberta's contemporary oilman. And it invites the ad's readers to embrace Shell Canada and the oil and gas industry more generally as part of our province's short-lived ranching history, while enveloping us, the viewer, into the protective arms of this urban gunslinger who's this innovative, energetic maverick, right? And so here we get to the figure of the PETRO cowboy. And this is a concept that was kind of invented or at least the phraseology was invented by a scholar named Cara Daggett, whom I've cited here. And there are these 5 components of the PETRO cowboy. So the origins or the figure of the settler cowboy. He is oil-soaked and coal-dusted in that his work sites are very frequently in extraction arenas of logging, oil and gas, and mining. He's innovative, he's energetic, right? He's this maverick. He's willing to engage in battles on our behalf, and most notably here in Alberta, this involves, dangerous shifts, and they are quite dangerous shifts up in the north on the oil sands. So he is driving Alberta's economic success with his willingness to put himself in danger, and he also, this PETRO cowboy, has to, in order to perform his masculinity properly, embody the threat of petrosexual violence. And so therein lies the threat here implicit in this Shell ad. The Shell ad's pump as phallus, right? This gas pump as phallus is a prime example of how fossil fuel industries use the association between rape and resource extraction in their advertising. At the same time, this specific figure of the PETRO cowboy, makes explicit the connection between Alberta's oil and gas industry and the potential for misogynistic violence that's inherent in this PETRO cowboy figure, this PETRO masculine figure. And this particular brand of masculinity is a gender performance that's aligned with the violence that's inherent in fossil fuel extraction, right? And so think about this in terms of that fossil fuel extraction has kind of come to function as a knowingly violent experience, right? It's this reassertion of white masculine power on an unruly planet that's perceived to be increasingly in need of violent authoritarian order. Again, I'm thinking a lot right now about Russian President Vladimir Putin. And so Daggett calls this petrosexual violence, and it's rooted in misogyny. But, and this is a bit of her being a little sarcastic, she talks about the aesthetics of fossil fuels, most particularly oil. They're actually ripe for recoding as expressions of sexualized power and orgasmic satisfaction. So in other words, economies like Alberta's that are based on oil and gas extraction, they provide a domain for like explosive letting go and all the pleasures that come with it. So drilling, digging, fracking, mountaintop removal, diesel trucks, or as the Shell advertisement promises, pumping gas, right? Because we kind of all know what's going to happen when the cowboy finally gets to the gas pump and he is able to release the pressure of the valve and the gas will then come spewing out all over the place. That is the sort of phallic nature behind this gas pump as phallus, right? And so one of the things that I argue in my book is that that the Stampede, because it continues to financially rely and boost Alberta's Calgary-based petroleum industry, the Stampede has contributed to what psychologist and organizational theorist Gloria Miller calls the cultural imprint that petromasculinity has left on our city, right? So by accepting sponsorship dollars from Shell Canada, by reprinting its advertisement in the 2012 Centennial Planner, the Stampede tacitly legitimizes the ad's message, which encourages this violent petrosexual defense of the frontier against Shell's enemies. And then by distributing this planner en masse at no charge to the more than 1 million Centennial Stampede goers, the organization was also complicit in promulgating that misogynistic message. Now, it is possible that you may think at this point that I've lost my marbles a wee bit, that I'm making way too much out of an advertisement, right? So bear with me, and let's keep on keeping on. So yes, thanks, Courtney. Courtney is awesome, just anticipating my every need here. And I've lost my timer. There it is. So I'm going to flip to a section towards the end of my book, which I call Queens of the Midway. And I want to talk about this tweet. So during the last weekend of the Calgary Stampede in 2011, so the year before the centennial, former Stampede president and chair of the board of directors, George Brookman, used his personal Twitter account to compare women Stampede goers to sex workers. His late night tweet, and you see it was 12:21 a.m. on July 17th, 2011, during the Stampede. His late night tweet asked, "With so many girls wearing the extreme short shorts, what the heck do hookers wear and how do you spot them?" Yeah. When asked about his comment by a journalist, Brookman defended it, arguing that if his daughters wore what he saw women wearing at the Stampede, he would take them home post-haste. He also lamented, quote, "So many girls have so much potential and then they dress like that," end quote. Brookman's slut-shaming tweet and unrepentant morning after paternalism prompted an indignant backlash among women on Stampede grounds that year, where, according to the journalists who were covering the story, there was no shortage of women and girls of all ages wearing what has become the fashion statement of choice this year. Now, we all know what Brookman's talking about. We've all seen the extreme short shorts, right? They're called Daisy Dukes. And in my own experience attending the Stampede over the course of the past decade, they are indeed as popular among women Stampede goers as is slut-shaming those same women for wearing them. Brookman's benevolently sexist, wow, I pronounced that incorrectly. Let me try again. Brookman's benevolently sexist, there it is, tweet was hardly revolutionary in this regard. But what intrigues me about this incident is what can be learned about how white women police each other at and during the Stampede. So the three women who were interviewed for the Brookman story were offended by his comments, to be sure, but they were also really invested in readers knowing that they were not, in fact, themselves sex workers. They said, "Everybody wears short shorts," one of them insisted, "but not all of them are hookers." Okay, so let's unpack all of this, right? There are apparently rules to wearing Daisy Dukes. Showing butt cheek is definitely off limits, and wearing a crop shirt all tied up is next level. I'm quoting these women. But all three women seem to agree that as long as you're dressed appropriately, the wearing of cutoff jeans doesn't automatically qualify someone for a career in street walking. That's a quote. That's all quotes. So to me, a curious feminist, the obvious intimation here is that a woman in Daisy Dukes who doesn't follow these three women's tacit understanding of what's appropriate could be a sex worker and thus deserves to be slut-shamed somehow or potentially raped because that becomes permissible, even justifiable, if she's asking for it by what she's wearing. For the record, sex workers don't deserve to be raped either, but this is part of how the white rodeo femininity that's reproduced by the Calgary Stampede makes its way onto the Stampede grounds and then off campus afterwards to what poet and author Anita Van Herk calls the happy streets of Victoria Park. So to clarify my point here, I actually want to return to the Centennial Stampede Planner, and I want to take a look at another advertisement. Courtney, flip my slide, please. And this one is for Lamley's Western Wear and Tack. So that's on the left-hand side here. And then I want to compare it to the one on the right, which is an advertisement by Sonosh City Pulse nightclub. Now, these are the only 2 advertisements in the Stampede Planner out of 36 that feature women. So it's definitely worth our while to compare and contrast that representation to expectations of what real women Stampede goers are supposed to wear and how they're supposed to behave. And it's important to note too that the women in each ad are culturally intelligible as white, which corresponds to the frontier myth. It corresponds to the existence and power of racism and white supremacy, right, that are always already present in the colonial discourse that's created, reified, and legitimized by Stampede-related cultural texts. Okay, so Courtney, switch my slide, please. So let's talk about this Lamley's ad, right? So let's just take a look at what we're seeing. So, she's wearing not Daisy Dukes, interestingly, right? She's wearing a long sleeve shirt. It looks like it's a U-neck, maybe it's a V-neck, but definitely not showing any cleavage, right? She's got her cowboy boots on. And the man, he's looking like those guys that I saw walking around downtown the first summer I got here, right? So, and then behind them are actually the sort of new image is superimposed over an old historical photo of Guy Wiedeck and his wife Flora Ledoux. And Flora Ledoux was a champion trick rider in her own right, which we don't often hear about. And Guy Wiedeck, of course, started the Calgary Stampede. And his ranch down Longview Way is still the Stampede Ranch. And so this woman would seem, according to these women that were interviewed after Brookman's Daisy Duke tweet, these women would seem to be dressed appropriately, right? Flora Ledoux and this woman here. And she's standing protectively in front of her cowboy as a proper cowgirl should. Her left knee's bent, her left foot's resting on some steps, her right hand's placed supportively on her cowboy's left shoulder, and they're both looking directly at the camera. But interestingly, we've not been invited to share in what's obviously a private moment between them, right? It seems very much as if we're interrupting somehow. Courtney, flip my slide, please. And so let's contrast this to this ad, which is for a now defunct nightclub, interestingly. We can't really tell if this woman's wearing Daisy Dukes, but her long sleeve black and white plaid Western style shirt is most definitely and very much against the tacit rules for appropriate dress, tied up, right? She's revealing her midriff and the top of her hips. She's got dark brown chin length hair, framing her face that's obviously quite heavily painted with makeup, heavy eyeliner, pink lipstick. And her fingers are sort of tipping her straw cowboy hat toward us. It's an invitation to join her inside this club after the rodeo. And she appears to be wearing an engagement or wedding ring on her left finger, which is potentially incongruous with both her demeanor and the shade of red, long associated in Western pop culture with sexuality and seduction, painted on her manicured nails. What's next? She asks invitingly, right? And so she's our host, she's our guide. Only she knows the answer to the question of what's next. We have to follow her inside this nightclub after the rodeo, away from the Stampede grounds, to find out. And so, according to the women who were interviewed about Brookman's tweet, this woman is dressed inappropriately, right? She could thus, according to their logic, quite easily be a hooker, quote unquote, despite the incongruity of that engagement or wedding ring on her left finger. But her outfit, interestingly, exemplifies some variation of what is, from what I can tell, the basic uniform for women servers and patrons alike at all the local bars and clubs during and often long before and after the Stampede, right? And so as our host, our guide to this club and the fun that we're promised it's going to continue there long after the Stampede ends. And so this woman is literally depicted as doing the job that so many women do during the Stampede, after the Stampede, before the Stampede, and all year long in Calgary. This is their job, right? To host and to serve at the local bars and clubs. Flip my slide, please, Courtney. And so one of the things that is interesting to me is that this sets up a very interesting virgin whore dichotomy that classifies all women as either one or the other, right? And it limits their autonomy. It encourages women to police, to discipline, and punish each other in order to avoid being labeled a hooker. And it also devalues the very real and incredibly hard work that women across Calgary, from servers to real-life sex workers, do to make the annual Stampede a success. Flip my slide, please, Courtney. I'm just mindful of the time, so I think I'm gonna sort of just quickly talk about visitors' responses. And these are specifically women who have gone to the Calgary Stampede, specifically Nashville North. And so one visitor talks about the lascivious offenses she witnessed, men fingering women underneath their skirts on the dance floor, the drug use. And she talks too about how she was carried onto the dance floor by a drunken cowboy and then sexually assaulted her. He tried to force his Budweiser dripping tongue down her throat. Lots of conversation on Yelp about the sexualized violence that women are subjected to at the Stampede, off campus, during the Stampede, as a consequence of some of what's socially acceptable there. And so, just like that, Courtney, flip my side, please. Just like that, we are arriving at this notion of the Stampede as a sex tourism destination. And sex tourism, quite simply defined, is a highly lucrative and growing sector of the tourism industry in which a primary purpose for travel is to engage in sex and sex-related activities. Now, interestingly, whenever I talk about the Stampede as a sex tourist destination, most people are like, oh yeah, that checks out. That makes sense. It's like they didn't know it, but then when I say it out loud, they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And so there's a party atmosphere that's generated during this annual event, and it often leads to risky behaviors, right? All of us in this room likely know what those behaviors are. I will sort of enumerate them. So condom sales go through the roof. This is a good thing, actually, because, you know, safer sex is good. Sexual and reproductive health clinics are consistently, year after year, reporting increased rates of STI testing. Yay, STI testing, that's good. And the sale of emergency contraception during and after the annual event. This is a telltale sign, by the way, that a good chunk of those cowboys and cowgirls who are playing fast and loose, I'm quoting Van Herk here, during Stampede week aren't necessarily doing it safely, though, right? Because if you have to have STI testing and you have to go for emergency contraception, then something has gone wrong in your heterosexual sexual encounter, in terms of if you didn't want to become pregnant or get an STI. And so this is only part of why the annual Stampede is actually considered Calgary's unofficial season of sexually transmitted infections. I'm quoting a journalist from 2007. This is just the ubiquitous lack of safer sex practices, and it's also evidenced by increased unplanned pregnancies that happen sort of every year. And divorce lawyers report increased business in the weeks and months following the Stampede. After all, as the Stampede cliche goes, it's not cheating, it's stampeding. One local florist, flip my slide, please, Courtney. One local florist even advertises 2 aspirin and an alibi with every purchase. Presumably, if you've cheated on your partner, you're going to maybe make them feel better by buying flowers on the way home. Whatever. I don't even, sometimes I walk through the world a little befuddled. So after stampeding hard, right, you're going to need a couple of aspirin to probably get rid of the hangover as well. And an alibi to cover up where you've been. So let me just flip pages here real quick. So let's talk about Alexis Frilling. Courtney, you can, yes, there we are. So many of you may well remember Alexis Frilling. She was the woman who was caught on video having a threesome during, although not at, the Stampede. And why this became such a big deal was because this was in July 2015, was that it was an anonymous video, right? So someone had anonymously, without the consent of any of the parties involved, videotaped a threesome and posted it on the internet. And the only face that was visible was Alexis Frilling's. The two men with whom she was engaged in this heterosexual encounter remain anonymous to my knowledge to this day because we couldn't see their faces. And so immediately folks started recognizing Alexis Frilling. They started mocking her, slut-shaming her. There was a social media frenzy. And so she, brilliant woman that she is, turned it on everybody and made her Facebook page public. She made a video on YouTube, and she's got a serious Twitter following. You know, she's basically created an enormous career out of this one encounter in which she did not consent to have her threesome put on the internet. But as one journalist noted, the reason why anybody cared about a threesome at the Calgary Stampede, right, because allegedly unconventional sexual encounters are kind of just another one of its cliches. But the reason anybody cared is because women are still big old dirty sluts for doing what they want with their bodies. Nobody, of course, pays any attention to the men for doing the same. Rather, we expect it of them, right? This is that sexual double standard that anybody who's taken Introduction to Women's and Gender Studies will know very well. So Frilling herself told a journalist, "I don't see why I should get bashed for it when the guys don't get bashed for it." And when asked why the difference, my colleague Rebecca Sullivan at the University of Calgary quite rightly pointed out that we live in a culture that defines women based on their sexual value to men and then abuses them for having it, right? And so just by way of kind of finishing up here, and there's so much more I could say, and I'm mindful of our time. What I want to do is kind of bring it back to the Calgary Stampede's connection to the oil and gas industry. Courtney, flip my slide like yeah, right. No, one more. There you go. No, back one. So Calgary's oil and gas companies, forward one actually. Yeah, there we go. So Calgary's oil and gas companies support the Stampede. The Stampede supports Calgary's oil and gas companies, particularly its rodeo events and Elbow River Camp, both of which, so Elbow River Camp used to be called Indian Village, right? Both the rodeo and Elbow River Camp are highly subsidized by oil and gas companies because, you know, doing so generates positive brand associations through a performed commitment to community. But these are the same corporations whose pipelines are being pushed through unceded lands without consent. So again, that rape metaphor, right? And whose employees have produced with impunity a whole bunch of racist, misogynistic decals that I talk about in the book at a different section. And so one of the folks that has worked a lot on this concept is this scholar named Mallet, and she's a sort of organizational executive and like organizational theorist. And she writes, oilfield dads raise their sons and daughters in an environment that values this toxic masculinity, and these ideologies become the norm. The oil companies perpetuate a culture that dictates that manhood is measured in lengths of pipe and the speed at which it was put in the ground, leaving men with no choice but to conform if they want a job. And so, in other words, flip my slide, please. In other words, the petro-masculinity of the oil and gas industry has become the hegemonic masculinity of Alberta, which is embodied in the figure of the Stampede's Petro cowboy. And those truck nuts my dad and I saw when I first moved to Calgary back in 2009, they weren't just laughable cliches. I mean, they're funny, but they're serious because they are settler colonial pedagogy. In other words, they make very clear what can happen if I and others who don't conform don't comply. And as the CEO of the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services, Deb Tomlinson, said in 2020, she wrote, "This is who we are, Alberta. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" And to use the words again of author Aritha Van Herk, someone's got to be accountable. So thanks, and I'm super excited to hear if you have questions or comments or anything else you might want to know about this work that I've been doing for 10 years.
Thank you so much, Kim. Okay, we've got one question in the chat. Oh, no, it's a comment. Kristen.
Am I allowed to ask verbally?
Yes, absolutely. We would love that.
Okay, amazing. So I just want to say thank you, Kimberly, for the presentation today. It was great. I was just curious about what type of work you've done surrounding taking your work to the people who definitely need to hear it. And I was just wondering about maybe if you could share some of the feedback you've gotten from people who are kind of super entrenched in this.
Oh, well, where can I begin? I think it's important to note, and I write this in the book, that I didn't set out, and nor is it my intention. It has never been my intention to denigrate entirely the Stampede. As I sort of said earlier, the Stampede does have some fairly positive qualities around kind of community solidarity, right? However, I did, okay. So the Stampede organization, from very early days, would not allow me into their archives, has not to this day acknowledged that I was researching or wrote this book, likely won't ever. I did have a meeting a few years ago with a corporate communications guy there at the Stampede, and he and I were in touch over my request to use in the book the ads that I showed you. There was some resistance to putting me in touch with the copyright holders. And so as a consequence, I actually didn't have permission to reprint those ads in the book. I had to do like these weird Kim drawings, which, and I'm not a drawer. So that was, I'll show you one actually. And I did send them a copy of the book because the corporate guy, he said, do send us a copy when you're done. I said, oh yeah, you're gonna love that, okay. And so I did, and I assume they received it. I haven't heard if they have. So this was sort of what I had to do with like the shell ad, for example, because I didn't have permission to reprint it, and this is not a violation of copyright. And so I don't know if that answers your question. Oh, I will say too that I did send a copy of the book to the mayor, the new mayor. And I know she got it because I was invited to the International Women's Day breakfast yesterday, but she hasn't been in touch personally, nor had any of her people, right? And the mayor of Calgary automatically, by default, sits on the Stampede board. So, so there's at least one stakeholder who's got it, and who hopefully, the mayor's a sociologist by training, and she is brilliant and smart and fabulous. And so, whether my work will matter to her and her work, I don't know. But that's kind of where I'm at so far, so I kind of feel like the best thing I can do is talk to folks that aren't affiliated with the Stampede, and maybe things will change that way. How's that for an answer?
Nice, thank you.
So Jasmine, yeah. What do I think, if anything, could be done to address the problems as a regular attendee? Oh, I love that question, Jasmine. Okay, so in the very end of the book, because I'm a feminist scholar, and so one of the things that I'm really committed to is not just poking and prodding and critiquing, but offering solutions, right? Offering some kind of like reprieve from this, because the Stampede is not going anywhere, and so it, you know, what can we do to make it better, right? And so as a regular attendee, I'll come back to that in a second, but you're more important than that. You're actually a regular citizen, right? You're a regular person. And so why not write to the Stampede and say, look, these are problems we have, you know, these are my experiences there. My friends have had these experiences, lots of people have had these experiences, and you all need to change some things. Like, let's make some gender neutral bathrooms, right? Let's do some anti-violence training for your staff and for your and for performers, for folks that are you know, in the rodeo, right? Let's kind of just create, like, why not as an organization can you not do this? You know, you have $1 gazillion, you have the support of so many community members and so many corporations, indeed city council and the mayor, and so you could do this work, right? So you can write to them, you can tweet at them, you can support hashtag Safe Stampede, which is an initiative by the Center for Sexuality here in our city that runs every summer. You know, you can volunteer for organizations during the Stampede. So I know that there are a few organizations, and if you want specifics, email me, in our city who during the Stampede offer safe spaces in the downtown core for folks that are trying to attend to Stampede, or maybe you're just trying to walk around in their regular everyday and are really feeling unsafe by the harassment. And potential for violence. So you could go and volunteer, you know, in one of those safe spaces. And so there's lots to be done. And as an attendee, yeah, I mean, there's nothing saying that you can't go and like have you know, your pride pin, or have a patriarchy kills pin, right? So folks can recognize you as an ally on the grounds. You know, there's so many little things that I think we can all do in our everyday, where we often feel like we might not have power, but and writing a letter to the editor of the Calgary Herald, you know, around Stampede time, being like, these have been my experiences, you know, the Stampede needs to figure themselves out, you know. And I do make a few suggestions along those lines in the end of my book, because again, it's super important that, you know, we just change the culture of this thing a bit. I don't necessarily want it to go away, it just has to shift, right? And they have the power to do it. In fact, their reaction to getting shut down during COVID, which I write about a little bit in the end here, proves to me that they have the structural and systematic kind of internal power to like really pivot and really shift quickly. And so why not prioritize this instead of something else, right? Or in addition to something else. Speak more to the gendered violence, settler colonial extractive violence parallel. Yeah, it is super reductive, right? And Steph, you know, I don't know that I have time to unpack the whole thing, but if you want to email me, and I'll put my email in the chat, I can send you like a little short list of references of folks that are working on this issue specifically. So Indigenous feminists are awesome on this issue, as are a few folks like I named Cara Daggett, and there's Sarah Darrow, who's at the University of Alberta. So there's some feminist political scientists who are working on sort of oil and gas extraction and connecting these dots in these ways. So yeah, so just shoot me an email and I'll send you a few resources.